All right, so you guys wanted to hear more about the Jose Guerrero case, and we're going to dive into it right now. This is a pretty intense story of a serial killer who was operating in Madera, California back in the 90s. Yeah, he was eventually convicted of murdering 3 women and also the attempted murder of a fourth. What's really interesting about this case is that it took almost 6 years to actually bring him to justice. And a big part of that was because DNA evidence was a pretty new thing at the time. So we're going to be looking at a Wikipedia article on Jose Guerrero today and see what we can learn.
Yeah, one of the things that I find really interesting about this case is the contrast between the brutality of the crimes and then kind of the setting. We're talking about Madera, California, a place that's known for its agriculture, its orchards, all this beauty.
Yeah, it's like this peaceful setting and then this darkness underneath it. So where does this whole story begin?
Well, our deep dive starts in April 1995. That's when the body of Julianne Woodley is discovered. She was a 42-year-old mother of 2, and she was found in an almond orchard just south of Madera. And the Wikipedia article doesn't hold back. I mean, goes into the details. She was raped, they use the term sodomy, and then she was shot.
Oh, wow, that's awful. What a way to start this deep dive, huh?
Yeah.
And it's interesting that the orchards kind of become this recurring theme with his crimes. Why do you think that is?
Well, it's difficult to say without really knowing Guerrero's psyche, but it's possible that he was just drawn to the isolation of the orchards, the concealment,
Right.
a place where he could exert control, carry out his crimes without being seen.
Yeah, that's a chilling thought. So later that same year, in November, Guerrero actually attacks another woman, 42-year-old Evelyn Estrada. But thankfully, this one goes a little bit differently.
Yeah, so this is where we really see the victim's bravery. Evelyn Estrada fought back against her attacker, and even though she had her throat slashed during the struggle, she managed to escape.
Wow. I mean, that's incredible, especially in an orchard like we're talking about. Must have been terrifying.
Absolutely. And, she survived, but she was left with physical and emotional scars. Evelyn's story is really a powerful testament to resilience, but it highlights how long trauma can last.
Yeah, that's so true. It's a reminder that the effects of these crimes go way beyond just the immediate physical harm. Sadly, not all of Guerrero's victims were as fortunate as Evelyn. In 1996, the body of Charlene Fowler, another one of his victims, is found. And again, it's in an orchard. And this time, she had been strangled to death.
Yeah, this consistency in location, it really does suggest a pattern, like a level of premeditation that's really disturbing. It makes you wonder, was he stalking these women, choosing them because of their vulnerability, or was it more opportunistic?
Yeah, that's a question we may never have the answer to.
Yeah.
Then in 1998, we have the case of Tamara Jones Hernandez. She was a 22-year-old, and she was visiting family in Madera from Eureka, California.
Right. So Tamara's case really stands out because she wasn't actually from Madera. She was just passing through, visiting loved ones, and then, her life was cut short. And what happened was one evening, she just stepped out to buy milk for the children and then vanished. Later on, her body was found near a vineyard, face down.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
It's so senseless. And again, we see this connection to the agricultural landscape of
Mhm.
Madera. The orchards, the vineyards, they're like these silent witnesses.
It's a haunting image, isn't it? These places of growth and life and abundance all tangled up with violence and death.
Now, the article we're looking at mentions that it's believed that Guerrero may have encountered some of his victims on C Street in Madera, which is an area that's kind of known for its connection to sex work.
Yeah, and it's really important to address that aspect of the case sensitively. The article does point out that not all of Guerrero's victims were confirmed to be engaged in sex work, so we have to be careful about making assumptions.
Right, for sure. The focus should always be on the victims and the fact that their lives were taken. But this information about C Street does kind of offer us a potential glimpse into how Guerrero might have chosen his victims, maybe targeting women he perceived as vulnerable.
Yeah, it's a theory, for sure, and it raises all these questions about the societal context of these crimes, like what led these women to C Street in the first place? What kind of systemic issues might have contributed to their vulnerability?
It's a lot to unpack. And it just adds this whole other layer to this already tragic story. So for almost 6 years, the case went cold. The families of the victims were left without answers. And Madera was a community that was gripped by fear. It seemed like Guerrero had just vanished.
And then, in 1999, there's this twist of fate. Guerrero gets arrested. Not for murder, though, for driving under the influence.
Wow, so this DUI becomes a turning point in the investigation.
Right, it's like a domino effect.
One event setting off this chain reaction that leads to justice.
Exactly, and it's not just the arrest itself, but what happens while he's in prison. So he ends up at Wasco State Prison, and that's where he makes a big mistake. He starts bragging about his
Oh,
crimes.
no, really? So his arrogance is what leads to his downfall.
Yeah, kind of poetic justice, you could say.
Yeah.
The very act of him trying to, like, assert his power and revel in this darkness, it leads to his exposure. And so this bragging, it catches the attention of the authorities, and that sets in motion a whole new chain of events.
Okay, so in 2004, just before Guerrero is about to be released from prison, there's a huge development in DNA technology.
Right, this is where the science gets really interesting. So the state is now collecting DNA samples from inmates as a matter of routine, and when they run Guerrero's sample, they get a hit.
And I'm assuming this hit was related to Tamara Hernandez's case.
You got it. The DNA evidence links Guerrero directly to the scene of Tamara's murder. It's the breakthrough they've been waiting for. So they apprehend him at his jail cell, extradite him back to Madera County to face charges.
Wow, that must have been such a huge moment for the victims' families, and for Madera in general.
I mean, yeah, after years of uncertainty and fear, they finally have a name, a face to connect to these horrific acts. It must have been a moment of relief, vindication, but also just a resurgence of grief. And for the community, it signals closure after all those years of fear.
This arrest is obviously a big turning point, but it's just the beginning, right?
Yeah, you're right. The arrest is just the first step. Now comes the process of building the case, presenting the evidence, navigating the legal system.
And that's where we'll pick up in the next part of our deep dive.
So, we've talked about how DNA evidence was kind of the key in this case. But it's really interesting to think about how DNA technology back then was still fairly new.
Yeah, that's true. It makes you wonder, like, what if all of this had happened just a couple of years earlier, before DNA testing was, like, widely used?
Exactly. It's crazy to think that he could have just served his time for the DUI and gotten out. And who knows what could have happened.
It's like chance really played a part in getting justice. But even with the DNA, there's still the question of how they connected Guerrero to the other murders.
Right, because the DNA match for Tamar Hernandez was huge, but it didn't automatically solve the other cases. But this is where, the investigation gets really impressive. Remember we talked about Guerrero bragging about his crimes in prison?
Yeah.
Well, that gave investigators a place to start, like a list of potential victims they could go back and look at.
So they were able to, like, retest evidence from the other crime scenes using the new DNA technology.
Exactly. And one by one, the matches started coming back. First for Tamar Hernandez, then Julianne Woodley, then Charlene Fowler.
Wow, so for the families, it must have been this long, agonizing wait to finally have that proof.
Absolutely. And remember, this is all happening while Guerrero's getting ready to be released from prison. It was like this race against time to make sure he didn't just walk free.
Sounds intense. So let's talk about the trial. It happens in 2009. And the article says it was the most high-profile case in Madera County since the 1976 Chowchilla kidnapping.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, the Chowchilla kidnapping was a national story. 26 kids and their bus driver were kidnapped and buried alive. For Madera, it was like this huge trauma.
So for Guerrero's trial to be compared to that, it really shows how big of an impact his crimes had.
No doubt, it was this pattern of violence that had held Madera hostage for years.
So the trial goes on for 10 days. And in the end, the jury finds Guerrero guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of attempted murder. So then comes the sentencing, and this is where things take another turn.
Right, because despite how awful Guerrero's crimes were and all the evidence against him, there's one group of people who didn't think he deserved the death penalty: the victims' families.
Wow, that's powerful. To go through something like that and still advocate against the death penalty?
It really speaks to their humanity. Even after all that suffering, they chose forgiveness.
And it wasn't just the families. Evelyn Estrada, the woman who survived Guerrero's attack, she also spoke out against the death penalty.
Yeah, that adds another layer to this story. This woman who had stared evil in the face and still held on to her belief that taking another life wasn't the answer.
That's true strength. But in the end, the court didn't agree.
No, they didn't. Despite the pleas from the families and Evelyn Estrada, Guerrero is sentenced to death in June 2009, and he's transferred to San Quentin State Prison.
So at this point, it seems like the story's over, right? Justice has been served.
Well, you'd think so, but the justice system moves slowly sometimes, and there's one more twist.
Oh, what is it?
In 2019, Governor Gavin Newsom put a moratorium on executions in California. Basically, he stopped all scheduled executions, including Guerrero's.
So Guerrero, the man who terrorized Madera and murdered those women, he's in this legal limbo.
Exactly. His fate's hanging in the balance, his life spared, at least for now, by a political decision.
Which brings us to the question, Could these murders have been prevented? Are there things we can do to stop people like him before they hurt others?
It's a tough question. Were there missed opportunities to intervene in Guerrero's life? Did his behavior before the murders suggest he was capable of this violence?
It's hard to know for sure.
Yeah.
But what about the societal factors? We talked about C Street and how vulnerable those women were. Could more have been done to address those issues? Poverty, inequality, exploitation.
Those are big issues that need big solutions. Education, job opportunities, affordable housing, support for addiction, and mental health. It's about creating a system that doesn't leave anyone behind.
You're right, it's not just about catching criminals after the fact. It's about fixing the problems that allow violence to happen.
And it's also about personal responsibility, being aware of your surroundings, speaking up when something's wrong, supporting policies that keep everyone safe.
We've talked about so much in this deep dive. The crimes, the trial, the sentence, the moratorium, the victims' families, the bigger picture. What stands out to you the most?
I think it's the human element that's most important. It's easy to get caught up in the details and the evidence. But this is really a story about people. The victims, their families, the community of Madeira.
You're right, we can't forget about them. It's important to talk about them, to remember who they were.
Exactly. Let's start with Julianne Woodley. She was a mother of two, and even though she faced challenges in her life, she was loved. And her death left a huge hole in her children's lives.
And then there's Evelyn Estrada. Her story is one of amazing strength. She not only survived the attack, but became an advocate for victims' rights.
Charlene Fowler, her life was tragically cut short. But she deserves to be remembered for who she was, not just how she died.
And finally, Tamara Jones Hernandez. Just visiting family, going to buy milk, and her life was taken.
These were real people with dreams, with families who love them. Their stories need to be heard, their lives honored.
Their stories really show us the true cost of violence and how it affects so many people. It's amazing how, even with all the twists and turns in this case, it always comes back to the human impact. Like, justice is important, but it can never really fix the damage that's been done.
That's so true. There's no verdict, no sentence that can bring those lives back or erase the pain. But I think the healing starts with acknowledging that pain and remembering the victims.
Yeah, and that's why it's important for us to keep telling their stories, to make sure people remember Julianne Woodley, Evelyn Estrada, Charlene Fowler, and Tamara Jones Hernandez.
Yeah.
Not just as victims, but as people who lived and loved.
Exactly. And we have to remember how this affected Madeira as a whole. They lived in fear for so long, not knowing who was responsible if it would happen again.
This case really changed things, not just with the DNA evidence, but in how we deal with these kinds of tragedies.
It made Madeira face some hard truths, about safety, about vulnerability, about how we protect people.
And that's part of the legacy of this case. It goes beyond Guerrero himself. It reminds us that we have to create communities where everyone feels safe.
It's a big challenge, but cases like this can push us to make changes.
So we've covered a lot. The crimes, the trial, the sentence, the moratorium, the families, the bigger picture. As we wrap things up, is there anything else that you think is important to mention?
It's just incredible how much chance played a role in this case. Like, if Guerrero hadn't gotten that DUI, if he hadn't bragged about what he did, if DNA technology hadn't advanced at just the right time, would he have ever been caught?
That's a really scary thought. It makes you think about all the cases that might still be unsolved.
It shows us that justice isn't always guaranteed, and that we need to keep supporting law enforcement, forensic science, and victims' families.
For anyone who wants to know more about this case, you can look at court records, news articles, even books.
There's a lot of information out there, and it's important to learn as much as you can.
So as we finish our deep dive, what's the one thing you want listeners to remember?
I want them to remember the victims, their lives, their stories, who they were as people. Let their memory inspire you to make your community safer, to support those who need help, to work towards a world without violence.
That's a great message. Thank you so much for talking about this with me today. It's been really eye-opening.
It was my pleasure. And to everyone listening, thanks for joining us. Remember, knowledge is power. And by learning about these issues, we can all help make the world a better place.